We present to you election integrity, safeguards and challenges in modern democracies. So what we're going to be talking about is, of course, the historical context of election integrity, the safeguards and mechanisms, challenges, as well as the case studies to this issue. So historical context. So we have ancient voting methods. When starting with ancient Athens, where democracy began, citizens would vote directly on decisions using things such as stones or tokens. This direct participation was a cornerstone of their democratic ideals. In contrast, ancient Rome was using a census-based system where votes were weighted according to wealth. Over time, secret ballots were introduced to reduce coercion, and a concept that remained crucial in modern elections even to this day. Now moving on to medieval systems. In medieval Europe, feudal systems often involved local lords and councils making decisions, with very little direct input from common people. However, in countries such as Iceland, the Althing Assembly represented an early form of parliamentary democracy where decisions were made through a public assembly, thus allowing for public representation. Now, moving forwards more, colonial America, they saw the rise of modern town meetings in New England, where direct democracy was practiced at a local level. One of these examples of the general representation of the people would probably have to be the House of Burgesses. The concept of electoral colleges were also emerging, influencing the U.S. electoral college system as we know today. We also have the topic of modern innovation, right? Over time, these systems are bound to evolve, right? So the introduction of the Australian ballot system in 1856 brought the secret ballot into modern elections, reducing voter intimidation. Today, in our modern age, many democracies use proportional representation to ensure fair representation of diverse voter preferences. And, overall, electronic voting systems have further advanced the process and offer convenience and greater efficiency to these processes. Now, when we talk about this, there's a clear link to the United States voting system. The U.S. voting system incorporates several of these historical elements. The Electoral College, influenced by an early colonial practice, determines presidential elections, as well as the use of secret ballots and modern electronic voting systems, reflecting innovation from more recent history, ensuring a secure and fair voting process. Election fraud and mismanagement has been placed on various democracies throughout history, and they have overall affected public trust and the integrity of electoral systems. We do have a bunch of historical cases that are notable to the topic, right? We have the 1876 U.S. presidential election, and this was overall just a controversy between Rutherford and Samuel Tilden. We have the 2000s U.S. presidential election, notably Bush v. Gore. This was one of the more recent ones, and I believe that all of you should know about this. It was the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. The decision was extremely close, and the outcome was hinging on Florida's votes, right? At this point, the Electoral College was booming. And the problem and main reason this was such a controversy was that it was about the confusing ballots and overall the mismanagement of the media trying to confuse its voters, right? Overall, the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore effectively ended the recount and awarded Florida's Electoral College votes to Bush, and many were unhappy with the decision. Moving on, we also have the 1927 Venezuelan elections, by which elections during the early 20th century were marked with significant issues of fraud, and notably the figure of we would be talking about would be Juan Vincent Gomez. And he would maintain power through electoral fraud, stuffing ballot boxes, and overall coercing voters to vote for him. Moving on, we have 2010 Afghan presidential election. The election where the president of Afghanistan saw widespread accusations of fraud once again. Fraudulent activity would be reported in, once again, ballot stuffing, voter tampering, and coercion of voting. 2018, the Zimbabwean election. The election in Zimbabwe was held after the resignation of a longtime leader, Robert Mugabe, and once again, this was an issue regarding fraud. 1990, another presidential election of Russia as we know today, although it is not publicly and directly stated, it is under the rule of a dictatorship. there has been many reports of fraudulent activity, and notably in 1990, reports emerged of ballot box stuffing and media control that favored Boris Yeltsin, who was eventually the quote-unquote winner. And finally, we have the 1954 U.S. Senate election in Illinois, where this was overall just an election for the U.S. Senate seat in Illinois between Paul Douglas and William G. Bill Thompson. Once again, this election was marked by irregularities of, more accusations of fraud, reports of voter fraud, and ballot stuffing. Now, among all these cases, we can see here a constant and consistent issue of voter registration and how easy to, be mismanaged and how easy election fraud can happen. Overall, it's important to note that these fraudulent activities can undermine democratic processes and affect governance all in itself. Understanding how these historical examples helps highlight the importance of transparency, oversight, and reforms will ensure fair and credible elections in the future to come. Moving on, we have election integrity and talking about the safeguards and mechanisms. So we have, regarding legality and regulation, three lenses that fall under it. They are gerrymandering. Essentially, gerrymandering is the controversial practice of redrawing electoral district boundaries to favor or benefit specific political parties or groups. I know we talked about this many times. Overall, this manipulation of boundaries creates districts that give one party an overall higher advantage over the other, resulting in unfair and unrepresentative electoral outcomes. Gerrymandering overall manipulates electoral districts and reduces the chance of fair representation and undermines voters' equal and equitable choice. Now, I put voter eligibility as it essentially refers to the requirements or checkpoints for a person to be allowed to vote in an election. Some of the most common criteria to reach this eligibility is to become, of course, a U.S. citizen or being 18 years of age. And finally, also being an actual resident of the voting district. Now, placing these eligibility checks will effectively allow for much more secure election processes. Finally, we have the electoral system laws. These laws basically define how votes are cast, collected, and overall counted. These votes will effectively be translated to actual votes in an election and allow for a balance in power, as well as mitigating or decreasing the overall chance for fraud or manipulation of actual voting ballots and individual votes. Now, elections over time have without a doubt evolved. One of the most recent developments in elections would be the way that data has been collected with the assistance of new and emerging technologies. So first I want to talk about OVRs, or the online voter registration systems. These OVRs impact election integrity by increasing the accessibility of those who wish to vote, as well as promoting higher voter participation. Now, holding these voter registration systems online also allows for lesser mistakes or, accidents from manual data entry by these individuals who want to register. And, overall, it just calls for an improvement and allows for improvement within the accuracy of voters and the roles that they hold within an election altogether. Finally, perhaps one of the best benefits of online systems or OVRs is the cost efficiency of it all. One of the most compelling arguments for OVRs is that, manually people can't find the time to go out manually register to vote. And these loads of documents also places a somewhat burden on administrations and allows for staffing. So overall, OVRs, or online voting registrations, allow for a reduction and freeing of resources and, manual hard labor. AVRs now. These are automated voter registrations, and it allows for increased efficiency and accuracy of all voting aspects of an election. Given that I have talked about the mechanisms of election integrity, I think it is very notable to mention how AVRs, automated voter registrations, impact the gathering of data, recording voting entries, and overall reduces the chance for human errors in data entry. Finally, when talking about the safeguards and mechanisms of elections and their integrity, I believe that three lenses can be denominated primarily from the topic of transparency and oversight. And they include the importance of transparency, the influence of media, and of course, the auditing or monitoring elections. The importance of transparency for elections is, in fact, that elections are a crucial part to our democracy. We as citizens don't necessarily have lots of power in the government by itself, but voting is the greatest power that we have been granted by the government. We as US citizens have the chance to impact our society and essentially build what is around us today, build our society and build together a community. I want to just, mention like how transparency is important. I know we mentioned before the 2000 elections of and the controversy of Gore v. Bush, and once again, this was one of the most controversial elections in U.S. history. And a reason for this was because of a lack of transparency and a mix of the influence of media trying to confuse the they were posting confusing media projections of the outcome, and it overall cast doubt on the reliability of the results and the electoral college. Overall, elections are a very important part of our democracy, and it allows us, who are U.S. citizens, to represent ourselves and truly act as people who aid in the building of our government through choosing who we wish to lead the nation. Therefore, there is a clear necessity for taking on and evolving safeguards and mechanisms, as well as evolving of voting technologies to ensure a legible vote.
Challenges to election integrity. So, just by giving the definition of an election fraud basically encompasses a range of illegal activities that compromise the integrity of the electoral process, which can include things like voter fraud, impersonation, duplicate voting, anything within that area. Well, I'm going to start by giving detailed overviews of what fraud looks like. So, starting off with voter and fraud impersonation, this type of fraud normally occurs when you vote in someone else's name. And this isn't just limited to whether the person is living or not. People might use a deceased person to cast in their vote, which is also a type of fraud. And moving on to duplication fraud. Duplication fraud is basically when you vote multiple times within the same election. And we know that we cannot cast the same vote twice within the election, but granted, or even more than twice. Ineligibility fraud counts for fraud that is casted by felons or non-citizens. So people not meeting residency requirements, they're not allowed to cast votes, but it is a type of fraud. So, moving on to ballot frauds. Ballot fraud stuffing is basically when you submit multiple fraudulent ballots to increase the vote count illegally, and tampering occurs when you alter or destroy ballots to try and change the outcome. And misdelivery is when you purposely deliver ballots to incorrect locations or addresses, inhibiting the process of, counting and tallying up the votes. That really hinders the process of counting up the votes. Voter suppression intimidation. This type of fraud is basically when one uses threats or coercion to try and influence how someone else votes or to try and discourage them from voting. Overall, just trying to not get your voice heard, even when voting is the greatest power a citizen can have to the government, just trying to get your voice heard. And disinformation would be when you purposely spread false information about voting procedures, dates, or candidate positions, try and confuse and mislead voters, especially when given the wrong dates or locations, can be detrimental to whether you can even vote or not. Poll closures would be when you are closing polling stations in areas with a tendency or demographic to lean towards one side, making it harder for those populations to vote. We all know of states being referred to as blue states or red states or swing states. Poll closures would basically try and target some of the states that the opposition likely has edge in and try and inhibit them from gaining more votes within that state. Electoral fraud manipulation of voter rolls. So this is basically when you add ineligible voters to voter lists or removing eligible voters from them. You're basically switching in and out of ineligible and eligible voters. Absentee ballot frauds would be when you illegally obtain or you illegally cast absentee or mail-in ballots. Illegal assistance is when you coerce or influence voters who need assistance to vote in a particular way, especially if they try to ask for help, then sometimes the person helping may or may not change the person's vote or give them false information on the entire process. Election official fraud tampering is basically when the elected officials change vote totals or results, especially during a important time as the presidential election. Some elected officials may want to change the votes, give them the false information to try and win the race to their side. Bias administration is when election officials improperly administer the election to favor a specific candidate or party. Campaign finance violations. This is when accepting or giving campaign contributions that violate campaign finance laws. The misuse of funds would be when you use campaign funds for personal expenses or other authorized purposes, especially when the government gives you money to try and fund for your entire election process. You would try and pocket some of that money and use it for your own benefit. This is more inclined to the modern and current day era where electronic voting is very prevalent. So electronic voting fraud is basically when you illegally access electronic voting systems to alter vote counts or election outcomes. Malware is using malicious software to interfere with the operation of electronic voting machines. Fake registrations. Basically, when you submit fraudulent voter registration forms to create fake voters that may not even exist. Misrepresentation. Misrepresentation is when misleading individuals during voter registration drives or do not submit the registration that the one that you have chose and they change your party affiliation or who you vote for without your consent. Chain of custody violations, which is basically improper handling. So this is when you mishandle ballots during the transportation or storage, leading to potential tampering or even the loss of some votes. Lack of oversight would be when you do not properly follow up with the movement or the total tally of the votes and election materials. And thank you.
Thank you for your time.